Hello, everyone. I'm Neil Wemman. I'm partner here at Hauser Wirth. I'm speaking to you from London. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate William Kentridge, Way All Tears, our current exhibition in our Hong Kong gallery, in close collaboration with Goodman Gallery. Today, we have William Kentridge joining us live from Johannesburg and Christopher Cahill, Executive Director of the Asia Art Archive, joining us live from Hong Kong to discuss Kentridge's imagined and real connections to Hong Kong, the importance of forgetting, and the treachery of the proper noun.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, thank you.
Here it is lunchtime in Johannesburg. What time is it for you where you are?
It's 8 p.m., so it's almost bedtime, post-dinner time for us
Great.
over here. Well, listen, William, it's great to see you. Great to see you again, and it was awesome to see your show. I did prepare a short introduction that I could read, and then we can just jump into more casually a conversation. So excuse the stiffness of the introduction for the first minute or two. So thank you, Neil, for the kind introduction of both William and myself and to the entire team at Hauser Wirth, including Lisen Tai, Stefan Zabrowski, Rubin, Tong Hu, and Ed Florence, and also to Anne at William's studio for the honor of conversing this evening, or as you pointed out, this afternoon, depending on where you are, with William Kentridge. So William, your work first came to my attention as a graduate student in art history. My seminar professor, Rosalind Krauss, was then resuscitating the worn modernist term medium specificity. And as an example of a more capacious, more generous, and more generative medium specificity, she took your drawings for projections, a suite of riveting animated films from the 1990s, related to Sybil, I think now on view at Hauser and Wirth as her example. And it was only years later that I came to understand drawings for projections as much more than after the fact illustrations of an idea. Rather, your work preceded and propelled Professor Krauss's theses, much like perhaps in your studio, and I hope to talk to you more about this tonight, the intelligence of hand and habit guide process, performance, and product. Your studio practice, it strikes me, and here I use practice with the implication of both variation and repetitive action, and of the practical, as in the material. Your studio practice does not make perfect so much as perhaps it falls short of or far exceeds perfection in ways beguiling and intriguing. And so with that, I'd love to kick off our conversation with what I found to be a pair of imperfect renderings of a horse and of a bird. So I'm wondering, William, if you might speak a little bit about these works and maybe how you decided to open your show with Ladder Horse on the right upon entering.
Yes, but Chris, maybe just to go back one stage. In South Africa, it's fairly common for African children to be given a name that is a quality. And we know a mother who had twins, and she named her twins. One was called Excellent, and she named the other one Perfect. And in our family, we had a debate. Which would you rather be? And my wife and one child in the family said, of course, they would want to be called Perfect. And our middle daughter and myself said, no, we'd hate to be perfect. We'd much rather be excellent. And when you say talking about the benefits of imperfection, the horse is, so let's talk about these two sculptures. The horse on the right, the ladder horse, is literally made from having a ladder, cutting it in half and seeing how that can turn into a horse. And it has to do with what is the minimum you need for you to be unable to resist the image of a horse. If it's just a ladder, you can see just a ladder. You cut it in half, you see a ladder that's just cut in half. But as soon as some other attributes come, a hint of a tail, something that we see as a long point, which can become the head, you can't stop seeing it also as a horse. You can see, of course, that it's got clamps and wood and a ladder, that it's how it's made. But nonetheless, there's something in our need to make sense of the world that translates it immediately into a ladder, however imperfect and however rudimentary it is. And I suppose that's what this sculpture is about, something that's both clearly not a horse and something that we can't resist being a horse. The bird, a little bit similar. The bird is more of a trompe-l'oeil because the ladder horse is made out of wood and metal clamps. And the bird, which you can see is cardboard and foam core and paper, in fact, is a bronze cast. And the bronze cast then painted to look like the paper and cardboard and drawing from which it was molded. So it's a kind of an anti-sculpture as well. What is the minimum you need to recognize bird or horse? And so that's not about saying how little do you need, it's really saying be so aware of the work we do to construct meaning in the world, to make sense of things rather than to recognize something. There's a difference if we have a real horse in front of us and we recognize the horse, we assume the work is there in the world. Our eyes are simply receiving the world. When it's just a ladder cut up and turned into a horse, we realize we are doing the work of making the horse. We as viewers are actively involved in the construction of sense. Sorry, that was a very long answer for a very straightforward question.
It's a wonderful answer, though, and I would love to delve slightly deeper into this because it strikes me if the pigeon or the bird is a trompe-l'oeil, it's a different kind of, let's say, a trickery, a trump, right? In some ways, the way you describe the horse is, as I hear it, a kind of, we finish the horse for it, right? We know it's incomplete, we finish it. But the trompe-l'oeil is something different. We think we know what it is, but then we are, maybe if we pick it up or hear a description of it, we realize that, yes, that what we see is not exactly what we get. And so it also bespeaks can I say a deception on the part of the object, on the part of the art object in this case?
Mm-hmm. Yep. It is. It has to do with, I suppose, an ongoing interest in perception. So there are many different things like a stereoscopic viewer that one can have in the studio, in which you know you're looking at two flat drawings or two flat photographs, but when they put them together, your brain gives the illusion of depth. So that's another kind of deception. We know we know we're looking at flat things, but we believe we're seeing depth. And in fact, what it is we know we're seeing two things. And when we see two things, we see a third thing. So we know we are seeing a stepladder and we're seeing a horse. And the third thing we see is, as it were, we sit somewhere behind ourselves and enjoy watching our own self-deception. That how could I think that's a horse when I can see it's a ladder? How can I think that's cardboard when I tap it and I know it's bronze? But there's part of me that still says, yes, it is bronze, but it's also still paper and cardboard. And it's that awareness of the pleasure and the sense of being alive we get in recognizing that the pleasure of the self-deception.
But it must be quite interesting as the artist making these works, William, in your studio. Can you describe for us a little bit when, for you as an artist, this ladder becomes a horse?
I was making it, as in the exhibition where there is this collection of small bronze objects, there was, each one is about the size of a fist, and each one kind of represents a word or an idea. And when working on, not on this set, but on a previous set of small sculptures, there was a small sculpture which was simply the sculpture of a ladder, as if a ladder was like a glyph, a word, a hieroglyph. This represents ladder, it's a drawing of a ladder, which is both a practical thing, but it's also like a very graphic drawing. And this was made, like all the others, out of cardboard and wax. And so a simple ladder structure, but very soon it was a very dull sculpture. It wasn't very interesting. So almost on a whim, I said, well, let's see if we cut it in half, the small cardboard ladder, and see if we can rearrange it and make a more interesting ladder or a different thing that's a broken ladder. And somehow in the first twisting of those two halves of the ladder from a single shape to a shape like that, suddenly the two legs of the ladder became four legs. It became a quadruped. And then I suppose I'd been working on horses, an easy thing was to add a small cardboard shape of a neck and a head and an offcut of cardboard for a tail. And so it ended up as a small horse about that size. And from that came the idea of what happens if we enlarge this to the size of an actual ladder. So it's still small for a horse, but it's the real size for a ladder. And then we found a real ladder and cut it up and worked on it. So I suppose it was in that moment of failure of the sculpture of the ladder. We didn't set out to make a failure. It was a failure. And once it's a failure, it's fantastic. A failure at that stage is a blessing because it means there's no anxiety about destroying it, about cutting it up, tearing it in half. A bad etching, a bad print of an etching means there are all the possibilities of redrawing it, tearing it up, shifting its shape. And so the bad stepladder sculpture gave the possibility of the finished horse.
Amazing. I love the fact that this is, of course, the 1/1 scale of the ladder that it is made of, and there's a kind of residual of let's say the initiating object that this was made, and actually I think that this is something that we can return to when we start looking at some of your bronzes, where my sense is that there's still a residual of the drawing. But before we move on there, you told me something, I think in our pre-conversation, of your plans for this ladder horse. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing with the audience members here, maybe.
So the horse on exhibition is as it were, the prototype. It's the actual wooden ladder with the metal clamps that hold it together and some screws. And in fact, it's a fixed sculpture. It's held together without the clamps as well as the clamps being there, but that's how it was made. And the idea now is to work on it a bit like the bird, to make a mold. We've made a mold of this wooden sculpture. And this will again be cast in a metal, in bronze, but then it will be painted so that it looks completely like that wooden sculpture. And there's a wonderful painter, Stella Olivier, who's worked with me doing theatrical painting and a lot of other trompe-l'oeil paintings, who painted the bird, who is brilliant at knowing how to get the different tones of Oregon pine or old oak or all the different woods. And so that will be a project that will take her a good many months after the casting of it. So it'll have two forms, the wooden one and the bronze one that should look identical, and you should have to go and tap them to know which is which.
Amazing. And I hope you have a chance to show these together so that people can tap them. And I hope that you show them at a space, Neil, I hope you're listening, where you allow audience members to touch the sculpture. Amazing. Well, listen, it sounds also like this transformation of the wooden ladder into the material of bronze will add a physical weight to this sculpture. I also feel like it would add a kind of metaphoric weight too. It brings it closer to, say, equestrian statues, which I know you have an abiding interest. I wonder if that idea of going from relatively lightweight, a ladder that should be something you can carry from place to place, to bronze, something that is probably very difficult to move, especially at this scale. This shift from weightlessness to weight might also be a theme given the title of this show, Way All Tears. And I know you spoke a little bit about it in the introductory video, but I wonder if you won't elaborate a little bit here, especially for people who may have come a little bit late.
Yeah.
Why this title, Way All Tears, this impossible, poetic, paradoxical effort to weigh emotion? weigh,
I mean, I think
weigh
it
something
has,
that is intangible?
it is something that is, well, it's tangible, but obviously tears are almost weightless. I mean, one drop of water. I think it also refers to the sense of saying, weigh all tears, as opposed to weigh all tears. In other words, all tears, everybody's grief has a source. So certainly during in the COVID pandemic, certainly around Johannesburg and in other parts of the world, slightly less so in Hong Kong, there have been so many deaths, so many premature deaths. Everybody, obviously, we know no one's going to escape, but there were a lot of deaths of people much younger than they would have expected to die. So there's a grief around families that have lost people in the pandemic. But there's also been a huge collateral damage of businesses that have failed, of people who've been unable to get work, who've been unable to practice their métier. All of these kinds of are other griefs and other tears. So it's also saying the expanse of what people have lost is very wide and continuous. So that's kind of the way all tears. But the way of, I suppose the weight is about the exhibition, which is full of material objects, very tangible objects. So when one thinks of a shadow or a silhouette, that's kind of without weight or substance. The shadow has no weight. And a printed letter in a book has no weight. You know, it's just a black ink on a material surface. So it says, how do we take these things that seem so intangible, whether it's a shadow, a silhouette, or a text, and give it the weight which we know it has emotionally? And so it started off with ink drawings, small ink drawings of shapes, and then these shapes cut out of black paper, so one had a series of weightless silhouettes. And then saying, what happens if these silhouettes get a heaviness, a thickness? And those become the small glyph sculptures, where the thinness of the paper gets made thicker with the use of wax and cardboard and cloth, and they turn into these small black squat sculptures. And these sculptures, which you can weigh in your hand, they have a certain way, like a weight of words, that you carry them in your hand. Some of them have then got expanded into the larger scale of the medium-sized bronze sculptures on the tables in the exhibition. So that sense of materiality, I suppose it's also a sense in an era, and as we are now in this digital world of this conversation, there's a sense of needing to remind myself, not just anyone else, of the importance of the analog, of the tangible, of that which one can feel, of the resistance of material in the world, of inertia, all of which disappear entirely in the digital world. There's no sense of having to accelerate an image across to send it out into the world. You know, you hit a button and it's gone at the speed of light from one section down a fiber optic cable somewhere else. So that sense of effort and work and having to get something done is very present in the weight of those bronzes, and you know how heavy they would be to lift up. You can see the painting on the canvas. You can feel the hours of work in the tapestries. So it is a sense of a belief in the work as central to what they are.
That's fascinating, and I'm going to cue into this word belief, because in some ways I'm trying to sort out in my mind, William, as you're speaking. So I have to admit that of all the works in this exhibition, Way All Tears, the titular work, which I expect would be a very important work, this is the work that most confounded me. It was the work that I couldn't quite figure out, or couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so this question might not make any sense whatsoever, and it has much more to do with my incomprehension than anything else. I mean, it strikes me, as you're talking about belief in the material, or transforming, say, silhouette into substance, that there is another sort of belief in the work that we're looking at now. And that is, say, telegraphed. And of course, I went to school at a moment when, of course, ideas of mapping and cartography were being critiqued, right? Cartesian cartography was being critiqued. And so I see this as a ground, let's say, in a work like Way All Tears, these maps, and even on the right-hand panel, it almost looks like it came from an invoice from a jewelry or a diamond company, something that had to do with, let's say, resource extraction. So I just wonder how what it means to have this kind of backdrop, right? This ground for a work like Way All Tears, the central work in this exhibition.
I think that the maps which have come into the work came in a very, sort of, not a strange way, but in an indirect way. Well, they came in because I was dealing with the question of color. And as you can see, most of my work and drawings is monochromatic. And when I work with color, I very often work with found color. And there's something about the different eras in which different atlases are printed or collections of maps are made that have very different but very specific palettes of color. So for example, in the tapestries, which I think are all maps of bus routes in different provinces of China in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, an old set of maps I found in a flea market in Shanghai 20 years ago. I bought those not so much because I was interested in the particular routes but in the particular acid pastel colors in which those maps were printed. And the same with this map. It has to do with a world that is not just a black and white texture behind. So it has to do with this shift in colors, but obviously it also has to do with the sense of people moving across a world, across a described world. Whether it's their world or a different world is not so vital. If you think of refugees moving across a map, across the world, they're crossing across other people's cartographies. A border is there not because they've wanted it, but because some previous political dispensationalist says that's the border. That's why he's shifting from one map across to another. That's as much as I can explain. The rest is wouldn't have had a thought out logic to it in advance. It had to do with an acceptance of something feeling right as those cut out figures hit a map or looked at on plain paper or were looked at on a map. That's obviously a question in this one of the painting of the backdrop, the difference between that and the much cruder torn paper of the figures on top. These are then melded together in the tapestry, as you've shown now here, where the different layers of our collage are melded together by being woven in the same stitch and the same material. And here there's a further transformation of detailed printing into the approximations you can get working with this mohair tapestry. So I'm not sure at all. Certainly the people weaving and myself would have no idea whether the rendering of different Chinese characters is illegible, interesting, or ridiculous. But I know that it hasn't worried me in the Roman scripts when words shift and go, because it's the idea of the map rather than anyone using that map to get from A to B.
Amazing. And I also appreciate that you chose the maps essentially for their formal qualities. If you're choosing it to introduce a palette, and there's something quite counterintuitive about that I like. I do remember two things come up and two kind of strains that, if you're willing, I would love to follow up on. The first is, I do remember in one of your Norton lectures, you spoke about maps as projections. I think you were talking specifically about Johannesburg at the time, as not just a record of the past, but as a aspiration. And I wonder if that plays into some of these maps as well. I'll just kind of list the things that are on my mind, and you can kind of pick them up as you please. The second thing is, you've spoken about your collaborator for the trompe-l'oeil horse, and also now about the weavers in these tapestries. And it strikes me that your studio, your extended studio, let's say, is a different kind of community, not a geopolitical one, but perhaps there's something else there that you articulate as a group or a community or a family. And I'd love to hear that contra the geopolitical lines that you described with countries. And then the third is, I am just so curious because I know you've been to China for your UCCA show. And in fact, you did a talk for Asia Art Archive back in 2015. I would love to hear how it feels for you to have this exhibition, your first solo exhibition in Hong Kong, when not physically being able to come.
So let's first talk about the studio. As you say, there are about, just so people get an idea, there are about 9 or 10 of us, I think, in the studio. Some in administration, a lot of people in some have a room with editors for different projects, and we've got people like Chris Waldo, who's doing the video today, but is also like a chief engineer of making and inventing mechanical objects that need to be made. So there is an immediate circle. Then there's a wider circle, also largely around Johannesburg, the foundry, the tapestry studios, print studios, which are not my studios, but which I rely on for a huge number of works, in which different collaborators, like Louis Olivier as a collaborator on the sculpture. And then there are people further afield. There's a costume and set designer for the theater pieces that are based in Belgium, in Spain, the lighting designer. And we gather together in Johannesburg each time there's a big project to be done, particularly the theater projects. So there is a kind of a shift around what's possible. If it's a drawing, then it doesn't help to have anyone else in the studio. And if it can be made out of cardboard and masking tape, I can do it. But as soon as it's anything more than that, and most things are more than that, then the studio expands into the different people being done. The second question, the question of China and Hong Kong. As you said, I'd had the pleasure of being in one of the Shanghai Biennales, and later on showing work in UCCA in Beijing, and doing the conversation at the archive, the Asia Pacific Art Archive, a few years ago in Hong Kong. But as with so many people, the connection with Hong Kong is partly mythical. I mean, images of Hong Kong as in its kind of colonial heyday of the Jockey Club. And of course, there's the image you have that this is a tiny island with 2 million people on the island. And so when I went there first, I absolutely assumed that every square inch would be full of high-rise buildings. So the first shock is that, in fact, 90% is nature, or 98% is nature, and there's this ribbon of buildings at the bottom. Now, the second, of course, is an image I'd had from my wife, who's had part of her schooling, of her high schooling at the Island School in Hong Kong. So the stories from her of life in Hong Kong and going out on boats to the remoter islands, and the kind of deluge of rain during the monsoon seasons also created an image of what Hong Kong was. Whether it was accurate or not, it sort of became quite a concrete image. And then, of course, all the spy novels, which are set in Hong Kong, all together combined to create an imagined context. And I have been to Hong Kong since, and I kind of get a better sense of the actual geography and the space and where things happen and how it fits together. And my experience of the exhibitions in Beijing and in Shanghai gave me some sense of other parts of the Chinese art world and world, tiny ones. But there've always been many. I mean, we know that 1,000 years ago, there was contact between China and Africa and early trading and things that long before the Europeans came to Africa, there was a trade across the Indian Ocean. So there was that sense. There was also a sense of the long trajectory of Chinese flower paintings, paintings of vegetables, which have come into different projects that I've done. And then much more recent histories, the Cultural Revolution, which was happening between 68 and 76, between when I was 13 years and 20 years old. all of these things were kind of fragments of China, which combined in my head to the image and understanding of where we are now. And of course, everything that's happened in Hong Kong in the last 2 years.
Indeed. I appreciate that you talk about the kind of mythical or constructed Hong Kong through fiction, literature, and what kind of embeds itself in the popular consciousness. Even I think for Hong Kongers, that is how the city is constructed. Even if one might try to deny it, or one might try to argue that there's something quote more real behind it. In fact, I think that mythical definition of a city, and perhaps this is similar for Johannesburg, and the lived realities of the populace, many lived realities of the populace, often become blurred. Well, you know, I would love to turn to the work too. I mean, one thing that also struck me during your brilliant series of Norton lectures at Harvard is, apropos Johannesburg, I think you made almost an off-the-cuff comment about how when there is success in revolution, that bodes very poorly. So I just wanted to put that on the table. It was a very interesting comment, I think.
Yes, I mean, I was talking
on your part.
I was talking specifically about colonial revolt, where you have a small army from the center policing a colony, and if there's a revolt in the colony, the worst thing that happens if there's a first success of the revolt. Because, you know, the experience in Africa has been what that does is it enrages the metropolis, that then sends a gigantic force completely out of proportions and acts with extreme brutality against the local population. It's a little bit of what's happening in Ukraine today. You have a sense that because they've succeeded in pushing back the Russian army around certain areas, the viciousness of the response will be extreme. And we've seen that in some of the towns which the Russian forces have had to leave, the kind of the massacre of civilians in those areas. So it's obviously if the revolt is successful, then everybody feels that's a relief. But along the way, there's so much bloodshed and pain. So that was just really an observation of what had happened in colonial places where there were, you know, like the genocide in Namibia, which was provoked by a revolt which had an initial success.
Indeed, and this, by the way, this contact between Africa and Asia that you began with, boy, I would love to see that pursued in perhaps your work and other people's work. I think that would be absolutely fascinating.
I think there are more and more people, historians, and through the historians, people in the, you know, in the world of writing, of papers, and of art, of understanding. You know, so much of our understanding of history has been apart from the internal history of Africa, but in terms of the contact of Africa with other parts of the world, always just looked at that part that came from Europe, or rather this way, from Europe down to the south of Africa, and assumed that was the discovery of the continent, when in fact there was this huge link of trading up and down the east coast of Africa that had been there many centuries before, both from China, but also from the Middle East. And the way in which the continent itself is so constructed through these different linkages. You know, there was always, whether it was ivory or gold that preceded the slave trade, coming from the center of Africa out either towards the east or later towards the west. And of course, in the center, independent kingdoms and histories continuing on their own. But I think that there's a great deal of historical research and of understanding, and after that, of internalizing what this new history really, or newly reconstructed history really means internally for all of us.
And indeed, the kind of the continuities and discontinuities between these larger histories, this kind of diplomatic history, and your studio activities, I know that they're not directly, well, they might be directly linked, but I know that the studio for you is a very special, is a place that is set apart, even if it addresses larger external concerns. And I wonder if now might be a good time to look at a kind of a work of yours. I think, you know, one of the most amazing work, one of the most, among the most amazing works at Hauser Wirth, of this projected series of drawings that are in Sibyl. And would you like to, maybe we should just look at it first, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about the myth that it's based on. So we start with the work, as you would suggest.
That's fine.
I see aspects of what you speak of in terms of colonial revolt or larger geopolitical concerns come in, especially with perhaps some of the language that you use. I think belief appeared twice there in just the snippet that we saw. And of course, this very powerful phrase, old gods have retired. The fact that a god would retire, first of all, is hilarious because they don't. They get dethroned, but they rarely retire. But I think that's fascinating. And of course, the use of what seems like an encyclopedia or a dictionary, this kind of authoritative, comprehensive text, which echoes this idea of gods and belief. And I wonder if you would like to share with the audience the myth of the Sibyl and how these ideas of God's belief and authority come into play.
Well, there are many stories about the Sibyl, but the one that struck me, so the Sibyl was an ancient prophetess. This particular Sibyl supposedly lived outside Naples at Cumae. And there were many of these prophetesses around the classical ancient Roman and Greek world. But the story of this Sibyl is that she could predict the future, and you would go to the Sibyl who lived in a cave, and you would write your question on a leaf. And your question might be, how long will I live? Will I survive COVID? You know, will I be prosperous in my life and in my job? All of these kinds of questions. And you'd write that on a leaf and you'd leave it at the mouth of her cave. And then she would write an answer to your question on another leaf and put it at the mouth of the cave. And you would go back to the cave to take your answer. But as you arrived, there would always be a wind blowing and the leaves would all scatter so that you never knew if the leaf you picked up was your fate or someone else's fate. So it was about living in a world of uncertainty, of not knowing what was going to happen and making that kind of visually apparent. So you then have the idea of the Sibyl's leaves, all these thousands of leaves. And of course, in English and in many other languages, a leaf and a page is the same word. You can talk about the leaf of a book. So you gather all the Sibyl's leaves and you put them into a single book. And that's kind of the projection that we're showing. a mixture of images and texts and phrases. A lot of the phrases taken from poets around the world, odd phrases and lines taken in many different languages, translated to English, and making up the text of the libretto of the projection.
This is amazing, and this kind of transformation from leaf to paper to a page of a dictionary to a flipping page of a dictionary is amazing. And in some ways, there are similar, let's say, transformations in your bronze sculptures as well, from leaves to people in a procession, or from leaves to a tree to a figure, to an abstraction in the procession. And let us take a look also at these incredible bronzes.
So these were all enlargements of these small-sized glyphs that are about this big, about the size, the weight of an object like that. And these are expanded. And when they're expanded, they stop being words, but take on much more the kind of the character of figures. In the case of the previous image, that selection of 8 figures or 7 figures on the platform, some of which are very clearly human, but others of which are like a plant form, a leaf or a tree, but which take their place in the procession, moving across a surface. So they're both kind of words you could almost read, but they also have the direction of movement of a procession walking. So there's a kind of anthropomorphic element in them.
There is indeed, and what strikes me the most about these is also I feel like their starting point as two-dimensional drawings is still there. I mean, they're almost extrusions, right? And we can think of extrusions as somewhere between a projection and a sculpture, as in a model sculpture. I mean, an extrusion is a form of modeling that is projection. So I think that's...
So this is, I think there's an element of that. And certainly they need to be seen as silhouettes also, in which case they feel just like extrusions, but in fact, in the making of them, they shift a lot as you go around, and they're not simply one profile made thick as an extrusion would be. And that's difficult to see in these particular photographs. In the actual exhibition, when you circulate around them, you see they're not. The danger was that they simply became extrusions. They need to have the clarity of image from one viewpoint that an extrusion has. But in fact, as you turn them, you need to see that they have a much richer life than just that.
And indeed, the very farthest sculpture to the left, this horse or this dog, it's amazing, right? Because it works at the very least in two perspectives. The kind of upturned extra leg, so to speak, disappears. Yeah. And that's really interesting because when you speak of, I mean, a silhouette might be a silhouette of a figure. It's just the outline of a figure, but a projection or a shadow, which you spoke about, it's kind of both, right? It's both. It is. I mean, it takes the shape of the thing it falls on.
Yeah. So that, I mean, that is the idea of, can one take something as immaterial as a shadow or silhouette and give it a heft?
And this idea of this in between, this midst transformation, I think is one of the most beguiling things about this exhibition. I do want to leave time for questions and answers as they pour in, because there's such there's quite a lot of interest here. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read some of the questions out loud. Here's one from an anonymous attendee. Could you share the stories behind the Chinese maps in the tapestries? When and where did you find them? And why do you keep them? And why did you use them here in this exhibition?
Okay. So I mean, as I mentioned earlier, these were I think I came in 1998 or 1999 to Shanghai at the occasion of one of the Shanghai Biennales, and spent some time in flea markets around Shanghai and Beijing, looking at different artifacts. It was astonishing to see a floor covered with hundreds of Tang horses. And of course, no way for me at all as a visitor there to know which ones had been made 3 weeks before and which ones had been made 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago. But there were also beautiful red megaphones, which purported to have come from the Cultural Revolution. Again, I couldn't tell if they were made 3 weeks ago and dented to look old or were the real objects. And I wasn't looking to buy a Tang horse, and I was happy to buy a megaphone, whether it was old or new. And the maps were something else. I always look for old books to draw on. So I went to secondhand bookstores and with a guide to see what the books were about, and bought a number of books which I've drawn on since. And these maps struck me for their color. And we collected a lot of these maps. And after I'd found some, the curators of the exhibition sent some of the interns from the exhibition to find other maps for me. And I'd held on to them. I held on to them for 20 years before using them, waiting to find the right moment with that scale of map and that color. And when this exhibition started, I thought this was exactly the right time to, as it were, bring the maps back towards China.
Well, there is a follow-up question to that,
sure.
And also from an anonymous attendee. And the attendee asks, you mentioned the use of found color through the maps. Do you find color too heavily loaded to adopt of your own choice?
No, I wish I had a good theoretical answer for not using color. It's rather that, as in my case, if I hear music, I can absolutely listen to it and hear when it's in tune. If something's out of tune, I have a very strong sense of musical appropriateness or being wrong. And it's the same thing if I look at color. If I look at an image, I can absolutely judge this is a good color, this is an interesting combination. But as with singing, the fact that I can hear how something is no help at all to me to try to sing in tune. And I go flat, and however hard I try, I can't find the right note. It's always just off. And the same way, if I'm mixing color myself, it's always just off. I can see how wrong it is without being able to pull it into a rightness. So I have to rely on a sensibility towards color, but that's in color that's already there, rather than me trying to make it myself. And when I used to do painting, yeah. So the painting behind me, the painting behind me on the wall of the studio, which is this big floral painting, in fact, is an anomaly. This is in preparation for my son's wedding next week, and the ceremony will happen in the back part of the studio on a table in front of that backdrop. And he certainly didn't want to get married in front of big black ink drawings. So there is this much more gentle backdrop, but it's not the norm in the studio. It's there for the week. After the wedding, it will come down.
Well, okay. Number one, congratulations to your sons. Number two, let's promise people who stay after the lecture that they'll hear you try to sing, William. And right. Number three, there is a question about related to the work behind you, and right. It is, could you please elaborate on the significance of the extensive use of flora in your work, flowers, flower arrangements, and trees?
So the interest in painting flowers came when I did the exhibition at the UCCA in Beijing. I don't know if that's 8 years ago or 10 years ago. And I was intrigued at some of the early Chinese ink paintings of both flowers and vegetables. And it was explained to me that these, when they were painted many hundreds of years ago, had a very particular significance. So if you're painting a painting of bok choy, and the weeds were nearby, this was a symbol that the emperor was not taking care of the further provinces of the empire. It was a subtle criticism. And there was a group of paintings known as black painters, where instead of painting white cherry blossoms on a branch, they were painted black. And this was a comment on the black times that the empire was going through at that time. And later on, during the Cultural Revolution, there were artists who before had been tolerated for their paintings, but then were criticized politically for not towing a party line in what they showed in their paintings. This would have been in the early 70s, I guess. And they were also characterized as black painters. This is what I was told by historians, Chinese historians. So that term went all the way back to these floral paintings from, I'm not sure which dynasty, but hundreds of years before. So that sense of the non-innocence of floral paintings became something I started working with. And then saying something which may be an innocent painting if it's the domestic scale one expects a still life to be, but which shifts when it's the size of the painting on the wall. I don't know if you can point to the big painting on the studio wall and just tilt it towards it. Yeah, that's as wide as you can get. But there's this wall-size painting of the size in black of the flowers.
Thank you,
by
the way.
So that's, I mean, and then the trees act as a kind of a self-portrait and a larger, I mean, they're not exactly specific portraits, but they do have a sense of a single being there, as if one was a tree. There's a nice line of one of the poets who says, "No, by dint of looking at a tree, I have become a tree." So I think of them as different kinds of self-portraits, all the trees.
Well, thank you for that answer. And also thank you very much for pulling back the camera and letting us glimpse into your studio, which is fabulous. And
yes, I'm sorry, it's very neat and clean in preparation for next week's event.
The wedding, of course.
Yeah, it's usually much more chaotic and crowded. But
I do love seeing the film, the just various devices that you are using in your art making.
I mean, we've got the old camera that was used for all the early animated films, and a sousaphone that stands in as a kind of studio hi-fi system.
Oh wow! So that works.
Well, it works. I mean, I don't know what you'll hear, but we can try.
Just stand close to it.
I'll stand close to it. I'll just find a random piece of music.
And this might be where you honor us with a karaoke here, William.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have just a thing playing through your cell phone, so you've got I don't know if you can hear it. And one puts it.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the studio hi-fi system.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Reverting back to a little bit about what you said about believing in the analog. I think that is, I think we appreciate that. And there's another question to do with an analog, or let's say a more outmoded system of making, from Yasmin Canvin. And Yasmin asks, you've spoke about thinking in material. Might you talk about how thinking in material applies to the processes of printmaking?
So, yes, I mean, there's a if one thinks of a copper plate, all the different marks you make on the plate, all the damages you do to the plate are what constitute the image on the plate, which gets inked up and sent through an etching press. And there's both a knowledge or a desire of the mark you're going to make on the plate, but it's very different from how it emerges as it's been inked and sent through the press. And you always have to respond to what comes through the press, what we call the proof, and adjust the plate according to that. And there are many ideas that come through in that proof, in that first printing, which shape and determine what the image becomes. So that's a way in which it's not simply a reception of your thinking, the plate, but it also thinks back for you and suggests other ideas and directions.
Well, I think there is also a related question. I appreciate how you have the printer's proof and you make adjustments. I think this is what this anonymous attendee is getting at in a different modality. This attendee asks, with your opera/film piece Sybil, how does Sybil, affect your process of working, producing something that would be seen live/in real time? So
I would say, I mean, there are a number of drawings which are made simply because they satisfy a need in a different medium. So working in an opera, there are images that the opera needs for its narrative journey, which would not have arisen if I was simply making a series of drawings. I wouldn't have thought of those images. But having said that, once they arrive as drawings, they're set in place or set in process a whole series of other suggestions of other images. And so a whole series of other drawings may arrive from one medium that have been prompted by a work in another medium. So that's the way the work in the theater and the drawings kind of interact. Things that happen in the drawing suggest ways of working with performance, and the performances change and suggest new drawings.
Well, I know you have a major performance upcoming, and I believe that that we'll hear a little bit more about it at the very end from Neil. But we have two final questions, and I'm going to kind of ask them together. They're both about the bronzes. The first is about what do you think about making editioned works versus unique works? And the second is the black bronze sculptures have an impressive presence, and how do you hope they will live on after the exhibitions? Can they be shown, for instance, outside in a public space?
Yeah, so there are, I mean, I started my life as an artist as a printmaker, making etchings, making monoprints. So the idea of the edition has always been part of what I've done. Very often there are a series of works which need to be seen, which are best seen together. So sometimes there's been split up, but if they're in an edition, it's possible for me to keep a complete set and still be able to show them in their complete way. So the drawings are generally unique. Work that can be editioned like a sculpture, because there's a mold, are usually small editions of 4 or 6 or something like that. Etchings are often in an edition of 20. They're all sort of hand wiped and inked, so it doesn't make sense to do a very large edition. And certainly the work to be seen outside, yes, there've been exhibitions of the sculptures outside. Various collectors or institutions have bought them to display them outside. The medium-sized bronzes, the size bronzes that are on the exhibition are essentially domestic size, and I would imagine them primarily inside, although there are some outside, but there are also some 3-meter versions of some of these images, which, some people can put them inside, but generally they would be outside.
Thank you for that. And okay, we do have one last question that popped in, and then we can give the floor back over to Neil. This attendee asks, I've seen a couple of your video works and it never fails to evoke, they never fail to evoke an emotional reaction. They are quite powerful. To me, their impact is amplified by the music and soundtrack. Interesting. Do you work with musicians to tailor each piece? And how does the sound affect the meaning of the works? I think this is a great question. And you might be able to speak of your background also in theater here.
Yeah, I mean, I think to do that question justice, we need a separate webinar on the relationship of image and sound. But essentially, the question is, when I'm working with the films, it's at a very early stage, thinking about the music and listening to a lot of different music, either with a composer who's writing music for it, or with different found music if you're working with extant music, or in this case, with the writer of the music for the chamber opera Sibyl. And then it's always a question, how does the music change what you are seeing? And it always does. The image changes how you hear, and the sound changes what you see. And it's a difficult thing to legislate or to predict, but it's very clear in the moment, as you're watching things, which things slow an image down, which things make something too jerky to follow. You know, depending where you start your music or where a crescendo is, it changes the meaning, it changes the grammar of the film. This is caused by that, or that is caused by this, depending on how your sound is placed. So that's kind of an ongoing 40-year question for me of sound and image together. And each new project is a new experiment in this. So we have a film with a certain piece of music we assume we're going to use, and then listen to it with a completely different kind of music and suddenly learn new things about the film.
Interesting. I just realized that this question and the previous question were also asking, there might have been something else behind them. The previous question ended with, would you show your bronze sculptures in public? And this question speaks about the kind of live performances, and let's just say the more, perhaps the more public performances, like the Sibyl performance you'll be having. Related to that, does the title "Weigh All Tears" refer to a call to action to take note of the consequences of our actions and events, whether that is COVID or a war? Are you asking us to consider the impact on society or community? So with that public aspect.
Yes, I think that the text is there and it's quite open-ended. And the suggestion in the question is not one that I would dispute, but it's not one that I had in my head when making it. And I think with a lot of the text and a lot of their work, there's a gap between a kind of an internal process of making and the way they can then take their own life, the works, outside of the studio. And they're connected to the world, so they do have an implication and an impulse to move outwards also.
And I see that formally too, also in the short clip of Sibyl. I mean, I cannot help but see two different qualities of line in your work. One is the closed line, which is the silhouette or the shadow, begins and it ends, and it is continuous. And in the other hand, you have a lot of rotation, a lot of spinning. So it is the closed line that becomes a tree that continues to spin, and there is a kind of external movement there too. And this quality of line that recurs in your work is absolutely magical. In a piece like Telephone, it just takes a couple of circles with exactly, and you just turned a blob of bronze into a telephone. So there's that kind of magic wand of your line. This has been an incredible conversation and privilege for me to speak to you, William. Thank you so much. Congratulations on an incredible exhibition. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us here in Hong Kong and the world. And I will pass it back to Neil.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Well, thank you both. I mean, can I just give a sort of virtual round of applause to the aforementioned excellent and perfect twins of today in the form of William and Chris. Really compelling, great conversation, and I love the sort of impromptu studio visit that it turned into at the same time. Thank you very much. Very generous of you, William. What a great insight. Thank you both for that. Before we end today, I just want to share two upcoming events. One is that next weekend, so Friday the 15th to Monday the 18th of April, we will have time-limited online screening of the Sibyl, which we saw a little snippet of today. So you can watch the full 10 minutes on hauserwirth.com. And the work, of course, is also available to view in person in the exhibition in Hong Kong. So do make your viewing appointments. And also the live production of Sibyl will be next performed at the Barbican here in London from Friday the 22nd of April to Sunday the 24th. And tickets, a few are left. It's nearly sold out, but they are available through barbican.org.uk. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great weekend ahead, and especially thank you to the excellent and perfect twins. Thank you, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.